habitats on Earth. It is not surprising that it has attracted this man's attention. Discovering animals and plants new to science is his life, and there's no better place to look than the jungles of Brazil. Who knows what he might find, what might be lurking in the dark. With a love of the wild and a special passion for primates, he's driven on in his search. Mark van Roosmalen never tires in his quest as the species hunter. Northern Brazil forest here supports untold colourful and secretive creatures. The Amazon region of South America is home to the richest primate populations on Earth, a fact that has attracted the attention of a very special man. Mark van Roosmalen is more than just a lover of monkeys. He's a primatologist, a hero for conservation and a professional species hunter. His work takes him deep into the jungle, and it's his love of monkeys in particular that draws him back time and time again to northern Brazil and the dense forests surrounding the Aripuana River. Mark has dedicated his life to finding new species and fighting to protect their environments. Now on board his houseboat, the Calibeia, Mark embarks on a new mission and wonders what secrets the forest still holds.
It all started in 1996 when somebody delivered a little monkey at my doorstep in Manaus. And I immediately saw that it was a new species of primate, that I didn't believe before that you could find new species of primate.
This little monkey, which Mark named Dwarf Marmoset in 1998 and later described as Calibeia humanis, launched a long line of new discoveries. Since then, Mark claims to have discovered more than 20 other previously unknown primates, and also a dwarf porcupine with a pink nose. Also interested in botany, Mark's research on the plants of the region are a standard text. It was Time magazine that dubbed him a hero of the planet because of his commitment to conservation work. Mark's recent work focuses on the forest surrounding the Aripuana River, an area of Brazilian rainforest the size of France. It takes a special knowledge to be able to pick out a new species from this vast sea of green. Looking for something new in this animal mecca is like looking for a needle in a biological haystack. Why is it so important to find new species? New species add considerable weight to his case to have this forest declared a sanctuary. It could be argued that some of the rarer animals and plants here are protected elsewhere, making a local sanctuary unnecessary. But if Mark could show that a unique kind was found here and nowhere else, it would greatly strengthen his chances. But how do you start looking for a new species of animal unknown to science? Mark has an unlikely source. He visits some friends that he considers to be the true field scientists, the people who've lived along the Aripuana River for generations. They have contact with all sorts of animals, from macaws to curassows, parrots to primates. Monkeys can end up as pets, and Mark knows that one family's pet might just turn out to be the world's scientific bombshell. He regularly visits the villages or caboclos. Doña Teresa invites him to see their latest addition, It's an adolescent marmoset. Doña Teresa took care of it after its mother was killed for the pot. The monkey belongs to a species that Mark described for the first time in 2000. He called it Mico manicorensis, after the town of Manicore on the Madeira River. The marmoset probably wouldn't live long in captivity, and Doña Teresa exchanges it for a bag of beans. Mark never pays for his finds. He doesn't want animals captured deliberately.
So that's exactly the way how I get all the monkeys. Because these people, local people, live on subsistence hunting, so they kill the mothers, and if they have dependent babies, they keep them like this one. And what is just what they put in the pot is scientific material for me.
Not only are the animals saved from a cramped and uncertain future, but they could help Mark get protection for animals so rare that they're completely unknown to the outside world. As Mark speeds away, the skies open over the village. Here, every year, up to 7 meters of water drench every square meter of forest floor in the floodplain forest. Once the soil is saturated, water seeps into the rivers. In some places, the water levels swell seasonally by over 10 meters, leaving nothing but the canopy stretching beyond the water's surface. Now flowers blossom, and fed by the nutrient-rich waters, fruits ripen. Creatures normally hidden in the depths of the forest and high up out of view descend to the floodplain to feed, making them easier to see. Among them, the spider monkey, one of the largest monkeys on the continent. Spider monkeys are easily distinguishable. They have the longest tails in the monkey family, which are used like a fifth limb to swing through the branches. Living in large troops, they split into smaller foraging parties during the day, spreading out to find the best feeding spots. The similar-looking woolly monkey eats a more varied diet of insects and small animals, but also descends to enjoy the rich fruit bounty. With food in abundance, there's plenty of time for play. Above water, any creature would have trouble making their way through the tangle of branches. But beneath the surface, it's a different story. Released from the cramped confines of the river, fish disperse between the submerged tree trunks. Animals that usually travel by foot are forced to swim. Sloths usually crawl from tree to tree. Now, though, they must paddle. Moving at their own pace, they're surprisingly good swimmers, but that's about as energetic as a sloth ever gets. Other strange forms swim by, giants lurking in the murky water. According to legend, when sailors of old glimpsed these creatures at sea, they mistook them for mermaids. The resemblance is not very striking. These are Amazonian manatees or sea cows, one of a few species called sirenians. They look like whales, but are in fact closely related to the elephant. Meanwhile, back on board the Calibeya, the little marmoset has settled in well and become a much-loved member of the crew. Beady-eyed, he spots a stowaway, a praying mantis, a tasty snack for the liveaboard pest control. Mark enjoys his new companion, but knows their time together is limited. Mark always takes the time to catch up with his neighbors and makes regular house calls to consult these local zoologists. Mark hears many remarkable stories from his friends. Who knows what creatures they will find? Ephraim tells of a large creature living in the jungle surrounding their village. Could this be a species unknown to science? At first, it doesn't sound all that remarkable. A tapir. According to the science books, just one species of tapir lives here, the South American tapir. Textbooks say 4 species of tapir live in the jungles of South America and Asia, the last members of an ancient family of animals related to horses and rhinos. The South American Brazilian tapir is the heaviest land mammal on the continent, weighing around 250 kilos. Tapirs all have the prehensile trunk, but the South American can be identified by the distinctive white ear tips and pale feet. But the animal Ephraim describes is half the size and jet black all over. If this were to turn out to be a new species, it would be electrifying. This may be the only place where the dark tapir lives, and without the knowledge of studies, it could be on the brink of extinction. It's vital to find out more, and that is Mark's mission in life. But the locals haven't finished yet. Peccaries look like pigs, but are more closely related to hippos. Science describes two species in the Amazon, the widespread collared peccary and the much larger and noisier white-lipped peccary. This species has a more limited range and moves through the forest in noisy groups of 100 animals or more. That's not what the locals see on their hunts. They describe 4 peccaries, including another white-lipped species that is redder in color and has white feet, and another kind they call Caetitumunde, the giant peccary. Unlike other peccary species living in herds, the much larger Caetitumunde is only seen in small family groups. They recall hunts for this larger prey. The world of museums, biology and scientific journals means little to these men. They just want to make sure their children have enough to eat. They sometimes hunt the giant peccary. Like other members of its family, it aggressively defends itself, but an animal this size provides a lot of meat. No white collar, no white lip. Their dinner is a species completely unknown to science. As the days pass, the Calibeya takes Mark and his crew further into the forest. What new surprises lie in wait? The golden morning sun reveals little sandbanks, the first signs that the floodwaters are subsiding. Already, these fingers of land have attracted skimmers who loudly lay claim to the banks. One morning, Mark has some surprise visitors. The men have killed another peccary, but knew their dinner would be of interest to Mark. The meat has already gone to feed their families, but the men kept the skin and pinned it out to dry. Mark instantly notes the large size, the stiff black mane, and the absence of a white lip or white collar. This skin comes from an animal unknown to science, a giant peccary. As Mark sits with his monkey friend, he recalls a similar gift, and what may turn out to be the biggest discovery of his career.
I was extremely lucky when I came to this little village on the Aripuanã River to do my usual interviews, and then the people told me that they just had hunted a manatee in the creek here, and then I was asking them how many types of manatee do you know, and they said 2, and then I noticed I was aware that this was a new species.
Frankie describes the animal killed. It was tiny, not much more than a meter in length, black with a distinctive white heart shape on its chest.
Ele tem tipo coração branco aqui, bem aqui assim.
Could it really be possible that such an impressive creature has managed to go unnoticed for so long? How might the dwarf manatee compare to its larger cousins? The Amazonian manatee is a rotund animal growing close to 3 meters in length, with a broad paddle-shaped tail and a flexible whiskered muzzle. Its body is a uniform dark grey with irregular flecks of white on the underside. All known manatees have a low reproductive rate, making them especially vulnerable to the effects of hunting and habitat loss. Will stories of a dwarf manatee hold water? Or are they just another myth of the region? Mark left the village with more than just stories. Once again, the kind people of the Aripuanã let him keep the leftovers of their meal. Later, Mark is able to compare a skull of a common Amazonian manatee with his new treasure, the skull and jawbone of what he believes is a dwarf manatee. Although similar in appearance, there are finer details that tell them apart.
So the most striking differences are the long elongated snout of the common one, and the small one has a very short trunk. Another striking difference is the brain case size. It's very narrow and in the common manatee, and then the small dwarf manatee has a relative much larger brain size.
Francis guides Mark up the Aripuanã River to the creek where the manatee was killed, hoping that there might be more in the same area. They spot one of the Amazon's oldest inhabitants. A bird whose ancestors rubbed shoulders with the dinosaurs. The Hoatzin. Hoatzins are known locally as the smelly pheasant for the musky odor they produce. But these birds are a biological wonder, a visual aid to the process of evolution. The chicks still have prehistoric features, including claws on their wings, just like Archaeopteryx, considered widely to be the first bird. They use the claws to scramble through the branches in the flooded forest. The claws disappear before adulthood. Hoatzins are unique birds, with complex stomachs to digest tough vegetation. Special bacteria needed for this harsh diet is passed to the chicks from their parents. The Hoatzin is a natural wonder and another threatened species in need of protection. Francis directs Mark into the Arawatsino, a tributary some 40 kilometers long. Overgrown and shallow, this flooded forest is clearly not suitable for bigger common manatees. But it could probably accommodate a smaller species. It is not an easy place to look. As a primatologist, Mark never stops scouring the treetops for monkeys. He spots one of the smaller residents of the canopy, a squirrel monkey.
I learned from the monkeys how to survive in the forest and what you can eat and what you can't eat by observing them. They taught me how to make a living without killing any animal.
Mark has become a vegetarian, mimicking the monkeys' fruity diets. Charismatic squirrel monkeys are among the monkey man's favorite subjects. The creek narrows with fallen trees forming barricades, but there is clearly lots of leaf matter. Could this be the food of the dwarf manatee? Dead wood lies across their path, but Mark won't allow such minor obstacles to get in his way. Not when the river ahead may hold such a huge secret. As the search for a new species continues, Mark hears a song that is music to his ears, the duet of titty monkeys. These monkeys also mean a lot to Mark. They were one of his earliest discoveries. He described them back in 2002. He named them Prince Bernhard titty monkeys in honor of his supporter, the Dutch Prince Bernhard. Much of their lives remain a mystery. They've never been filmed in the wild before now. The end of the road. but at least Mark has samples of the dwarf manatee's food.
This is about the farthest we can get after all these logs over the river. But I'm happy to have seen the habitat of the dwarf manatee, because the local people in Francis, they say that the dwarf manatee is feeding mainly on these two species of Eliocharis grass.
If this is true, it would make the dwarf manatee differ in its feeding behavior from its larger cousin. The Amazon manatee feeds at the surface on floating plants. It seems that the new species may be a bottom feeder. Mark will have to try again in the dry season. Once home, the Calibeya gets another visit. The unusual watchman announces their arrival. River traders bring in supplies of eggs and flour. Mark always exchanges news with these people. As the traders spend their whole time traveling up and down the river, they often have useful information and current news. September sees a change in the weather. The huge floodwaters finally subside, revealing the forest floor once more. The Calibeya's progress has slowed to negotiate newly emerging sandbanks. Mark uses the downtime to revisit a childhood fantasy, the Lost World. Not so fanciful now as Mark searches for missing giants himself. Calibeya's captain weaves her slowly through treacherous sandbanks, some of which he can barely see below the surface. At the height of the dry season, the river reveals its skeleton, with sandbanks sticking out like ribs from the murk. Ground-nesting birds, such as nightjars, crouch on their nests to prevent the sun hard-boiling their eggs. People lived here as far back as the Stone Age, and now the newly exposed rocks tell an ancient story.
Here the Stone Age Indians clearly depicted a manatee. Here's the tail of the manatee, and here's the head. And I consider this a good omen in the search for the dwarf manatee. Maybe they depicted the dwarf manatee. I hope so. This is one of the nicest engravings here. It's of a dolphin. It's a long, elongated snout and a high forehead.
Unlike other dolphins, pink river dolphins or botos can turn their necks because the vertebrae have not fused. When the forest floods, botos twist through the tree trunks. They have long tooth-lined beaks and in the murky waters of the Amazon have lost the need for sight. Their tiny eyes give them a prehistoric appearance. The dolphins use sophisticated internal sonar to avoid collision in the gloom. sonar doesn't prevent collisions above the surface, though. The Calibea has run aground for the 4th time. It takes a little patience and some careful navigating to get them back on track. Finally, the ship reaches the Arowazino Creek. Home, Mark believes, to the dwarf manatee. It snakes back into the heart of the mysterious rainforest. Could secret creatures live here, hidden from human eyes? After months underwater, the sandy riverbanks are rich in minerals from decaying vegetation. Butterflies flock to lick up the nutritious cocktail. The water is refreshing to drink as well, despite its off-putting colour. Mark is anxious to press on in his search for the dwarf manatee. A find this size could draw international attention to the region, perhaps creating pressure to give it official protection, saving not only a new species, but protecting the habitat of the monkeys that Mark so loves. With that fresh inspiration, he presses on in his search. Francis joins him again, along with his brother Ephraim. Logs and branches clog up the creek. Progress upstream is frustratingly slow. It's a bit of a helter-skelter ride, and they keep the chainsaw close at hand. This is dangerous work. Francis spots one of the logs they cut just a few months ago, in the rainy season. It shows just how far the water level has dropped, some 4 or 5 meters. The speedboat's engine shatters the peace of the rainforest, disturbing the inhabitants. They spot an empty den, but the owners are nearby. The 3 men stop to get a closer look. Giant otters, the largest members of the ferret family, agile fish eaters at nearly 2 meters long. Mark decides to take a dip. Giant otters live in large family troops and call loudly to each other through the forest. Once a common sight in the Amazon basin, hunting for pelts has greatly reduced their numbers. The otters seem reluctant to approach the bather, so Mark takes a look at their home instead. Otters don't always dig their own dens. Sometimes they find a natural cavity, such as this one, in the roots of a tangled tree. Butterflies have gathered on the den floor, perhaps absorbing minerals from the otter's urine or oil from their last fishy meal. Other traces of the feast remain. Large scales, perhaps from the jarraky fish, one of their favorite fish prey. It's a welcome interlude and a reminder of the rare and important species of the region and the need for their protection. The search must continue.
Vamos.
You have to be pretty fit to hunt for manatee in the Aripuanã River. Only small caimans could live in this shallow creek. The spectacled caiman grows to just over 2 meters, but unlike its relative the black caiman, it's unlikely to attack humans. Mark looks for a good spot to begin his search. With a likely-looking area selected, the men string a net across the river. They hope that if a manatee is travelling downstream, they'll be able to corral it, holding it in a netted part of the river for a few days, giving Mark a chance to examine it and confirm the discovery. While the trap settles into the river, Mark, ever inquisitive, takes a stroll. Jungle dramas are being played out at all levels, and Mark finds great interest in it all. From the animals to the plants on which they live, he even spots a new species that he found just a few months before.
Here's the flower of Gustavia. So this represents a new species. It's amazing because it has the biggest fruit in the genus. It has the most spectacular white, distinct flower in the genus. And then it's representing a new species.
Yet another new species. More evidence that the biodiversity of the Aripuanã region ranks among the highest in the world. Aside from little reptiles and insects, there are monkeys here too. The new species of marmoset. Mark can't help but take some time to watch their natural behavior. Like most marmosets, this new species appears to live in close-knit family groups, each defending a territory of their own. He hopes soon to return his captive friend to a wild group like this. At the moment, the little monkey is a bit young to stand its ground with a wild pack, but the time will come soon enough. The word marmoset comes from the French for grotesque, but the squirrel-like monkeys have won Mark's heart. Unlike other primates, these have specialized in eating gum. In areas where gum trees are plentiful, there can be as many as 50 groups of marmosets in a single square kilometre of forest. There are much larger animals in the area too. The tapirs are the biggest, pushing their way through the undergrowth with their compact bodies and feeding themselves with prehensile trunks. This is the common species, but maybe others lurk in the forest. Predators of the tapir are few and far between. The great cats have been almost hunted out of existence, though a few pumas still stalk in the shadows. This is the same kind of mountain lion that ranges from Florida to Patagonia. Unlike many cats, these jungle dwellers are quite unafraid of water. With large predators around, Mark has the safety of his blade, but the knife is more for hacking through the dense vegetation than self-defense.
We set the second fence about 1.5 kilometers upstream, but we saw a place where they recently had browsed the Eliocharis grass.
Francis tells Mark how the dwarf manatee feeds.
So in July he saw from a distance that a manatee was feeding on a place like this. They have a sloppy way of browsing. They're eating and but then lots of grass stems float and they don't go into the mouth.
By contrast, the larger manatee doesn't eat the grass. It's a surface feeder, preferring larger aquatic plants like water hyacinth. This adds weight to Mark's idea that the smaller dwarf manatee is a bottom feeder. How much food would it need, and what size of territory would it require? The Amazon manatee eats 10 to 15 kilos a day and spends up to 8 hours feeding. They migrate with the rains and are capable of fasting for up to 200 days during periods of drought. Could this provide a model for the ecology of the new species? The men plan to spend several nights in the forest. The forest provides their evening menu. Watched over by his little companion, Mark catches up on some research. It's important for him to keep up to date with developments in the scientific community. It's easy to nod off when serenaded by a chorus of frogs and insects. Early morning, and the search begins in earnest. The men scour every pool. A few months ago, these fish dispersed through the flooded forest. Now, in the low river, they swim in tight shoals. The men keep an eye out for hidden dangers. Mark spots a stingray, despite its superb camouflage of sand and stillness. It has a poisonous barb on its tail. If it lashes out, it could inflict an agonizing wound. It's nearly a meter across, but quickly disappears again under a fine dusting of sand. A reminder that even large animals can remain undetected in the forest. A kilometer and a half later, they reach the downstream net, but hours in the water have taken their toll.
I feel very cold. I'm totally undercooled, and it shows how you can almost freeze to death in the rainforest. After 1.5 hours diving and looking under the logs and under the deep pools, we didn't find any manatee, but we have good hopes that tomorrow we go another few kilometers upstream.
The men dismantle the lowest net and set up again further upstream. They work in this way for 1 week, covering some 12 kilometers of river. On one trek through the Iguapu, they discover signs of another large animal, the biggest feline predator in the Amazonian jungle. And it has recently sharpened its claws. The predator has left its mark. The scratch marks on the tree trunk show just how high the jaguar stretched.
It's more than 2.5 meters. The moment that I see this, then I think about it as a possible threat. But I still think that a fallen tree or a fallen tree branch is more likely way to be killed in this one.
The jaguar, the real lord of the forest, the largest and most secretive cat of the Americas. The dense forest remains its final stronghold.
Jaguars are known to prey upon aquatic animals and caimans, for instance. So it's probably the only predator for the dwarf manatee.
has just time for one last swim. Plenty of small caimans, but no dwarf manatees. Mark's frustration grows because everywhere in the creek he sees the blunt ends of the Eleocharis grass. He believes only a manatee would chomp the grass like this. He finds a Stone Age carving of a manatee. Why else would ancient Indians depict a manatee in this small creek unless they'd seen them here? All too soon, they reach the lower net. The search is over.
No luck this time. No manatees in this stretch of the river.
Francis, Ephraim and Mark pack up the nets for the last time. The mission is over for the time being. But while they're deep in the forest, one important task remains. Time for one member of the family to say goodbye. Mark had never planned to keep his little stowaway and has decided that it's time to return him to the forest. It will be wonderful to see him back in the wild. If Mark hadn't intervened, it would have stayed tied up in a village hut and would not have lived for long. A life in captivity rarely agrees with wild animals. Mark has had plenty of experience rehabilitating orphaned monkeys into the wild and begins by placing his little friend in a suitable spot. The monkey calls out into the forest, and from a distance, Mark can watch and wait for somebody to return the call. And he doesn't have to wait long. From past experience, Mark knows that if released near a wild group, this animal will be fine. Confident that the troop will now adopt and care for the youngster, and that the little monkey is big and bold enough to stand up for himself, Mark releases him. It's time to leave the forest and its secrets behind, a little disappointed that they haven't found the manatee, but renewed by the wealth of other wildlife in this region. The river may not have yielded a new manatee, but it seems the forest won't let his efforts go unrewarded. A vulture abandons its meal, an agouti. Mark has never seen this species before.
This is an agouti, but I know almost for sure that it's a non-described species of agouti.
Agoutis with orange-brown fur live on either side of the Aripuanã River, but this specimen, sandwiched in the middle, has a greenish-black coat. Agoutis are long-legged rodents that forage for fallen fruits and seeds on the forest floor. They're hard to see, fast and agile, able to leap 2 meters to escape attack. The carcass was a lucky find. Mark may have stumbled across yet another new species of small mammal. And the forest still hasn't finished with Mark. It saves the best till last. A light shower forces the men to rest for a day. Francis and Ephraim tell Mark of a nearby wallow, which they believe will attract animals from the forest. As soon as the rain stops, Ephraim leads him to the spot. These forest people are skilled trackers, a necessity when you're making your living from the rainforest. They don't miss any signs of a passing animal. Among the fresh prints, Ephraim notices something that sends a shiver down Mark's spine. A large hoof print. This wasn't left by a white-lipped peccary, or by a collared peccary. Mark immediately builds a viewing platform, determined not to miss the opportunity of seeing this creature never seen in the flesh before. The peccary, known to hunters, yet still unknown to science. He settles down to wait. And wait. And wait. There's plenty to see, but no sign of the peccary. At last, his patience pays off. A large animal edges nervously into view. It doesn't have a white lip or a white collar. A giant peccary. It has a stiff black mane, like the skin the hunters gave Mark. It has never been seen by a scientist before, and certainly never filmed. It lives in a small family group, confirming the observations just as the local people described it. Altogether, there are 4, 2 adults and 2 youngsters. Mark, utterly thrilled, takes in every detail. Not only does he get the chance to examine a living animal, but it's being filmed for the first time. Typically for peccaries, the animals are wary. Being one of the larger prey species, they're a favorite meal of jaguars and other larger predators, including man. Then, just minutes after they arrived, the giant peccaries begin to move on.
Yeah, I'm so happy now because after sitting here for ages on the platform, I finally got some nice footage of a whole family of the new species of peccary. So now I can publish this new species. So I'm extremely happy, and I leave this platform as soon as possible with my treasure.
This gives Mark all he needs to announce his discovery to the world, yet another new species. Yet in spite of its natural wealth, this area is not included on a conservation map.
This area is so special that I think it deserves to be declared by UNESCO and World Heritage Site.
Having finally captured the elusive giant peccary on film, Mark was able to reveal this new species to the world. He hopes to argue the case that this amazing biodiversity deserves protection, both for the species we know and those that we are yet to find. And above all, he will keep searching and fighting with skill, tenacity, and an untiring passion to preserve the wonderful world of his beloved monkeys. Mark van Rooselen, the species hunter.
Leurs yeux sont sensibles à la lumière polarisée. Ils voient dans le noir le plus total.
Les calamars géants se déplacent en expulsant violemment l'eau à travers un entonnoir musculeux. Ce sont des animaux extrêmement rapides. Comment les cachalots font-ils pour les attraper? La caméra nous permettra peut-être de le découvrir.
L'idée, c'est de placer cette caméra de manière à voir au-dessus de la tête de l'animal. Elle permet de le suivre pendant qu'il chasse, qu'il capture ou dévore ses proies. C'est pratiquement l'unique moyen de savoir ce que font les animaux qui plongent à ces profondeurs.
Rendal a déjà fixé des caméras sur le dos de requins-baleines. Il a ainsi découvert qu'ils attirent les petits poissons et leurs prédateurs. La caméra est un concentré de technologie. Elle est équipée d'une diode électroluminescente et d'un hydrophone.
Comment on fait pour l'arrimer sur le cachalot?
Les calamars géants utilisent des ventouses pour saisir leurs proies et les attraper. On utilise nous aussi des sortes de ventouses pour attacher notre matériel. C'est un peu l'arroseur arrosé.
On va la coller sur notre proie.
Oui. Cette approche n'a que des avantages. On obtient les données voulues sans blesser l'animal.
Pour approcher les cétacés, il faut s'avancer en canot à moteur. En général, ils se déplacent en groupe. Il suffit d'en apercevoir un pour localiser tout un clan.
5 degrés à tribord, à 300 mètres.
La ventouse et la caméra sont reliées par un câble. Elles sont fixées au bout d'une perche en fibre de carbone de 8 mètres de long. Ryan et Rendal vont guider la perche. Diane manœuvre le canot et Willem surveille la force d'aspiration de la ventouse.
Il y en a 3 qui viennent de plonger. En voilà un, regardez ça.
Lequel est le plus proche?
L'équipe est tendue. Comment les cachalots vont-ils réagir? Sur le navire qui sert de base, le capitaine guette les cétacés.
On a vu un cachalot émerger tout près, à tribord.
En général, les cachalots restent 8 minutes en surface entre deux plongées.
On va s'approcher doucement pour qu'ils s'habituent à nous, les suivre et puis tenter notre chance. On est prêt?
Je pense que oui. C'est bon pour toi? Reste là.
Attention à ne pas le toucher.
Ne bouge pas.
Il est parti. On n'a plus qu'à recommencer.
Ce cachalot s'est vite échappé. Un autre sera-t-il moins timide? Un deuxième candidat émerge à 100 mètres de là.
On est prêt?
Ne bouge pas. Reste avec nous. Reste avec nous.
On peut y aller.
Ne bouge pas.
Vas-y vite, vite, vite!
Ça y est!
Ça va?
Ouais. La deuxième, c'était la bonne.
On a eu du bol!
Une sacrée veine, oui. Le voilà! Il aime pas ça. Je n'ai pas vu la caméra. Elle est puissante, cette ventouse. C'était énorme.
Je crois que c'est bon, là.
Oui, c'est bien accroché.
C'était vraiment magique. On s'était fixé une mission et en 20 minutes, on l'a menée à bien. L'inconvénient, c'est que ça ne plaît pas au cachalot. C'est juste une ventouse, mais ça le gêne.
Oui, c'était un sacré stress.
Quelques minutes plus tard, l'enthousiasme de l'équipe retombe. Le cachalot s'est débarrassé de la caméra.
Là-bas, elle est revenue à la surface.
Il va falloir vérifier son état et comprendre les raisons pour lesquelles elle s'est décrochée.
Il faut revenir à bord pour vérifier que la ventouse fonctionne.
L'équipe découvre aussi que l'opération n'est pas sans risque.
J'ai eu peur qu'on soit renversé. J'ai cru que Ryan avait été touché, qu'il avait reçu un coup sur la tête, alors j'ai agrippé son t-shirt pour le retenir. Heureusement, il avait juste perdu l'équilibre. Mais on a eu chaud. C'est pas très agréable.
La queue du cachalot est arrivée sur Rendal et moi à une vitesse foudroyante. Si on avait réagi quelques centièmes de seconde plus tard, je ne sais pas ce qui serait passé. Il faut qu'on revoie notre plan d'approche et qu'on se montre plus prudent. On a tendance à oublier à quel point ces animaux sont puissants.
Bob Cranston, lui, est bien conscient du danger.
Quand on nage avec les baleines, il y a une zone de danger que j'appelle l'arc de la mort. C'est l'intervalle qui sépare la nageoire pectorale de la queue. Si vous vous retrouvez entre la pectorale et la queue, et que celle-ci fouette l'eau d'un mouvement latéral, elle peut vous arracher la tête, vous briser la poitrine ou vous casser les côtes. Bref, vous faire passer un sale quart d'heure. C'est ça l'arc de la mort.
Ça ne va pas être facile de trouver un autre cachalot.
On va en trouver près de l'île, c'est sûr et certain.
San Pedro Martyr est une île volcanique. Les eaux qui l'entourent comptent parmi les plus riches du monde.
Cet océan est très prolifique parce qu'il est froid. L'eau froide contient plus d'oxygène. En plus, le coefficient de marée est très puissant. Avec le mouvement de la mer, les nutriments sont remués 2 fois par jour.
C'est un endroit unique. On sent une énergie, une activité débordante.
Le golfe de Californie abrite au moins 20 espèces de baleines et de dauphins. On peut y apercevoir de grands bancs de globicéphales ou baleines pilotes. Les baleines bleues et les baleines grises viennent se reproduire ici. Et les dauphins pullulent. Une aubaine pour les spécialistes des mammifères marins. Diane passe énormément de temps en mer. Elle cherche à comprendre la place des baleines dans cet écosystème.
Ce sont des animaux gigantesques, mais on peut les approcher de très près. Ils tolèrent votre présence. Il est là, juste là. Vous le voyez? Regardez, on voit sa mâchoire inférieure. Elle est toute blanche. Il nous a aperçus à la dernière minute. Il a tourné et il a plongé, comme un gentil géant. On sait très peu de choses sur eux. La moindre découverte est un événement.
Les cachalots sont très nombreux dans le golfe, plus d'1 millier. Mais pourquoi?
Il y a une forte concentration de calamars géants dans cette zone. C'est sans doute pour cela qu'on trouve autant de cachalots dans le golfe.
Les grands dauphins accompagnent souvent les cachalots. Les scientifiques sont en bonne compagnie.
Il a fait un saut périlleux.
Diane veut examiner la composition chimique de la peau des cachalots. Elle saura ainsi ce qu'ils mangent.
C'est parfait là, c'est le bon moment.
Les cachalots muent régulièrement. Ryan a de la chance. C'est lui qui va aller ramasser des échantillons de peau.
C'est la première fois que je vais plonger avec des cachalots. Je suis très content, mais c'est quand même un peu angoissant. Ce sont de gros animaux.
Il a un bout de peau. Et un gros morceau en plus. C'est formidable, Ryan.
Je l'ai approché par derrière. C'était super.
C'est parfait. Parfait.
C'était génial de nager avec eux. J'ai sauté et j'ai suivi 2 ou 3 individus. Il y avait même un petit. C'est un sentiment indescriptible. C'est incroyable.
Voilà à quoi ressemble la peau de cachalot. Elle est très sombre et très dure. On va analyser ce bout de peau. Il nous permettra de savoir si leur régime alimentaire a changé.
D'après les recherches de Diane, cette population de cachalots se nourrit presque exclusivement de calamars géants. Un grand mâle peut en dévorer 350 en une journée. Il faut approcher les mâles avec prudence. Ils sont 2 fois plus gros que les femelles. Et ils peuvent se montrer agressifs.
Je ne sais pas comment il va réagir. C'est un peu dangereux. C'est un grand mâle, comme dans Moby Dick.
Très vite, le cétacé les détecte. Et à la différence des candidats précédents, il n'a pas peur. Au contraire, il les toise. Le monstre de 30 tonnes se dirige vers eux.
Qu'est-ce qu'il va faire? On te regarde, c'est tout.
C'est un grand individu. Il mesure plus de 20 mètres de long. Les scientifiques peuvent admirer son énorme tête carrée. La peau des cachalots est très caractéristique. Elle est ridée. Il s'éloigne. Il était simplement curieux.
Il est parti.
À tribord. Il vient vers nous.
Deuxième jour de la mission. L'équipe se trouve au milieu d'un cercle très animé.
Ils sont énormes. Il y en a 3, là, là et derrière.
Il y a des mâles partout. 1, 2, 3.
T'as vu sa gueule grande ouverte? Ils se disputent un territoire.
Mieux vaut ne pas tenter de les marquer.
La réaction d'un grand mâle pourrait être plus violente, puisqu'ils sont 2 fois plus grands. Et je ne pense pas qu'on ait envie de voir ce que ça donne.
Tu sais pourquoi Diane ne veut pas arrimer de caméra sur un mâle? Elle a peur qu'il revienne nous agresser.
C'est vrai?
Mais oui, bien sûr. Oui, ils sont dangereux.
Si on tente le coup sur un mâle, il y aura seulement une plus grosse queue qui tentera de nous faire chavirer. Mais qu'elle soit grande ou petite, de toute façon, si elle nous frappe, on boira la tasse. Au fond, ça ne fait pas de grande différence.
Je suis catégorique, pas de mâle. On ne sait pas comment ils peuvent réagir.
Il continue donc de chercher des individus de taille plus modeste. Mais même un petit cachalot sera toujours aussi grand que leur canot.
Tu es prêt?
Prêt. Il faut tenter notre chance.
On a loupé notre coup.
On y retourne. On va chercher un autre groupe.
Au moins, ils ne reviennent pas nous attaquer.
La ventouse est moins agressive qu'un harpon, mais elle est beaucoup plus difficile à fixer au dos de l'animal.
Il va plonger. C'est la dernière chance de la journée.
Avancez. Avancez. Attention.
On réessayera demain.
Le lendemain matin, la mer est calme. Une femelle se repose à la surface. Et elle n'est pas seule.
Il y a un petit. Super.
La mère se prépare à plonger. Elle part pêcher dans les profondeurs. Son petit va rester seul pendant une quarantaine de minutes. C'est une chance pour l'équipe. Les petits cachalots sont souvent curieux et joueurs. Leur instinct les pousse à suivre tout ce qui ressemble de près ou de loin à un cachalot adulte. Ce petit pèse déjà 1 tonne et mesure 4 mètres de long. Il passe ses journées à respirer, téter et suivre sa mère. La mère et son petit rejoignent maintenant le groupe. Mais il se produit quelque chose d'inhabituel. Les cachalots se rapprochent pour nager de concert. Diane a déjà vu ce type de comportement.
En voilà un autre. Ils vont se grouper pour nager tous ensemble. C'est une façon de se retrouver. C'est un moment privilégié.
Les cachalots semblent apprécier ce contact étroit. Ils roulent les uns sur les autres. C'est un véritable concert de clics. L'un de ces sons s'appelle coda. Ce sont des séquences de 3 à 20 clics. Ils servent à communiquer avec les autres membres du groupe. Un cachalot entend un son et le répète aussitôt. Les scientifiques ont analysé ces séquences. Ils ont découvert que leur schéma correspondait à celui d'une conversation. Que se disent-ils? On l'ignore encore.
Ils ont envie de jouer. Regardez-les. Ils passent un moment convivial. Ils batifolent, ils se frottent les uns sur les autres. On voit des têtes et des queues émerger. C'est dans ces moments-là qu'ils émettent des codas. Et là, on a vraiment envie d'aller sous l'eau, voir ce qui se passe.
Mais pourquoi ils font ça?
C'est le petit, je crois qu'il avait envie de jouer. Regardez, ils sont tous alignés. Avec des dauphins qui passent. J'adore ces moments-là. C'est merveilleux de les observer, d'être près d'eux en mer. C'est le bonheur ce matin.
Après 5 jours de pratique, l'équipe a mis au point une méthode d'approche efficace.
Attends.
Reste à trouver le bon cachalot.
Plus près de la tête. Encore. Non. Allez! Ça n'aspire pas. Ça y est! Non, elle s'est détachée. Mince.
L'équipe est fatiguée. La perche elle-même commence à montrer des signes de faiblesse.
Elle est cassée. Attends. Vas-y doucement. Il faut rentrer.
Ces cachalots ont cassé ma perche en fibre de carbone. C'est assez impressionnant parce que c'est vraiment difficile à casser. Maintenant, la perche ne fait plus 8 mètres, mais 6. Ça veut dire que Ryan sera encore plus près de l'arc de la mort. Et il ne sait même pas ce que c'est.
La perche brisée n'est pas la seule surprise de la journée. Il se passe quelque chose près de la surface. Des centaines de mouettes plongent dans l'eau. C'est un immense banc de sardines. Bob veut filmer cette intense activité. C'est une aubaine.
Il y a des chances qu'ils disparaissent à notre arrivée. Mais si on arrive à temps, je pourrais peut-être faire quelques plans. Les oiseaux sont juste au-dessus du banc. Quand les dauphins vont arriver, ils vont faire remonter les sardines et les mouettes auront leur chance. Nous aussi, peut-être, si on est assez rapide. Ils vont passer près de nous à 100 à l'heure.
Les dauphins ont repéré les plongeurs. Ils bifurquent pour les éviter.
Par ici.
C'est raté encore une fois. L'un d'eux nous a regardés. Et à part ça, on n'a pratiquement rien vu.
On a entendu leur sonar et toutes sortes de clics et de sons. Et puis, plus rien.
La nuit tombe. Bientôt, les calamars géants vont remonter à la surface pour se nourrir. Ryan veut équiper l'un d'eux d'un capteur. Mais pour cela, il faut d'abord l'attraper. Ça tombe bien, Bob est un expert.
Un vrai pêcheur ne révèle jamais tous ses secrets, mais en voici quelques-uns. D'abord, on allume des torches. Et ça, c'est un leurre. Il est phosphorescent.
Tu la charges à la lumière?
Oui, on la charge à bloc et on la met à l'eau. Et voilà le bout de la ligne. Prends-la.
Super.
C'est ainsi que les Mexicains pêchent le calamar. Les calamars géants vivent dans les abysses. Même les plongeurs les plus expérimentés ne peuvent descendre à de telles profondeurs. La nuit, ils remontent en vaste banc de parfois plus d'1 millier d'individus. La croissance de cet animal vorace est extrêmement rapide. Bob s'est rendu compte qu'il était aussi très curieux.
Ces calamars géants sont des machines à manger. Ils dévorent des poissons ou même leurs congénères. Bref, tout ce qui leur tombe sous les tentacules.
Leurs puissants tentacules sont équipés de ventouses. Elles servent à attraper les proies et à les goûter.
Les poissons sont souvent gluants. Pour les attraper, il faut une arme fatale. Et ces ventouses sont pourvues de petites dents à l'intérieur.
Et au milieu des tentacules, une bouche coupante qui déchire les proies. Le calamar géant a une si terrible réputation qu'on l'a surnommé le Diable Rouge. Ryan en a attrapé un.
C'est un monstre. Je dirais qu'il mesure bien 1,70 m. Le voilà. Regardez-moi ça! C'est dingue! Waouh! La vache!
Un petit coup de main
La
peut-être?
vache!
Allez, je vais t'aider à le tenir. Pose vite ton capteur qu'on le remette à l'eau.
Je vais l'accrocher là. Je fais un tour. On va savoir à quelle profondeur il va, s'il suit les mêmes schémas que le grand cachalot.
Ce truc enregistre la profondeur?
Profondeur, température de l'eau et position. Je tiens ça.
Il est assez fragile.
On va pouvoir le remettre. Je le libère.
Voilà, super. On le remet à l'eau? Hein, on y va? On le soulève? Attention, t'es en train de lui déchirer la peau, là. C'est un animal très fragile.
On y va.
Allez, c'est parti.
Il ondule, c'est bon. C'est fou cet animal, hein?
C'est beau, hein?
Quelle bête!
Le calamar géant retourne tout droit vers les eaux froides des profondeurs. Il est adapté aux très hautes pressions. En surface, il est bien moins à l'aise. Ce premier succès encourage l'équipe. Elle est déterminée à marquer un cachalot. Même avec une perche raccourcie. Le canot est entouré de mâles. Chacun d'eux tente d'approcher un groupe de femelles. Dans ce genre de situation, il arrive qu'ils se battent.
On y va tout doucement.
L'un des grands mâles se détourne des autres. Le canot semble l'intéresser.
Tu t'approches de nous? Je ne suis pas rassurée. Il vient droit sur nous.
Il va passer à côté.
Aïe, aïe, aïe. Ah non, mon Dieu. Oh. Mais qu'est-ce qu'il fait?
Il nous a touchés.
Non, 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 ça va.
Ça va?
Il nous dit de nous éloigner, de partir, c'est tout.
Il marque son territoire.
Exactement. La queue est sous le canot.
Ça t'est déjà arrivé?
Non, mais j'en avais entendu parler.
T'en avais entendu parler?
Oui, mon Dieu. C'était incroyable. C'est fou, il s'est approché et nous a poussés doucement, comme pour nous dire « restez à distance ». Il n'y a rien d'autre à dire.
Ils l'ont échappé belle. Le grand mâle disparaît aussi vite qu'il est venu. Les scientifiques décident de chercher un autre groupe. Ils repèrent une femelle seule. Elle se repose en surface. C'est leur dernière chance.
On ne va pas te faire de mal. On va juste mettre une petite ventouse sur la tête.
Encore quelques secondes. Elle n'est pas contente. Ça a super bien marché.
On a trouvé le bon cachalot au bon moment.
C'était très facile. Ce cachalot ne s'y attendait pas. C'est le premier de la journée. Avec un gentil géant, c'est facile. Mais quand on essaie plusieurs fois et que ça ne marche pas, c'est rageant. Mais là, ça ne s'est pas décroché.
Ouais, c'est génial. Bon, qu'est-ce qu'on fait maintenant, Rendal?
On en équipe un autre. Non, avant ça, il faut localiser cette caméra. Elle a un émetteur satellite et radio. On pourra la récupérer dès qu'il remontera, d'ici 24 heures. Le cachalot doit être dans les profondeurs.
Rendal guette le signal radio.
On attend que le cachalot marqué remonte à la surface.
Il n'y a pas encore de signal à la surface.
C'est une bonne nouvelle. Si la caméra s'était détachée, elle serait remontée et son émetteur se serait déclenché. Si on n'entend rien, c'est qu'elle est sûrement encore fixée sur l'animal.
10 cachalots sont remontés. Ils forment un groupe compact.
On voit bien qu'ils restent ensemble. Mais si on regarde de près, on remarque que certains sont face à face.
Est-ce une réponse à l'appel de la femelle marquée? Quelque chose les a poussés à se réunir rapidement.
Ça, c'est ce qu'on appelle une unité sociale. Ce sont des femelles qui forment un groupe avec leurs petits. Elles vivent ensemble pendant de nombreuses années.
Quelques minutes avant le coucher du soleil, Diane repère la caméra.
Là-bas.
Ouais, je la vois.
Elle est juste là.
Elle s'est décrochée du cachalot.
Elle est restée en place pendant 1 heure. Pour un premier essai, je suis plutôt satisfait. Quand ça marche, on est à la fois heureux et surpris.
Tout le monde a hâte de voir les images enregistrées. Les données indiquent que la femelle a plongé à 300 mètres. Elle s'est déplacée à une vitesse de 3 km/h. La diode illumine le plancton qu'elle a croisé en chemin. L'écran est quasiment noir. Mais l'hydrophone a enregistré une foule de sons.
Une chose est sûre, ces sons sont des codas. Ce ne sont pas de simples clics.
Les codas permettent aux cachalots de communiquer entre eux. Le cétacé est ensuite remonté à la surface, vers la lumière. Et surprise, il n'est pas seul.
Qu'est-ce que c'est? Il y a plus d'un cachalot.
Regardez, il y en a un là.
Ils nagent tous ensemble. Ils se tiennent très près les uns des autres.
C'est magnifique.
Il y en a un qui nage à l'envers. Il bouge à peine. On dirait qu'il plane.
C'est bien filmé, hein. C'est fou, l'homme peut être remplacé par une ventouse.
C'est incroyable.
On en voit 5 dans le cadre.
6 même.
Et encore des codas. Ils se sont rapprochés parce que cette femelle a un problème. Ils sont venus pour l'aider. L'autre cachalot se tient vraiment tout près d'elle. Il essaie peut-être de la débarrasser de la ventouse.
La caméra a eu le temps de filmer 1 heure. Cette étude est une nouvelle fenêtre ouverte sur le monde des cachalots. À l'avenir, ce dispositif permettra de les accompagner dans les profondeurs.
Je pense que le groupe escorte le cachalot que nous avons marqué. La femelle a dû être surprise. Elle a envoyé des codas aux autres pour leur dire qu'elle avait quelque chose sur le dos.
Les images montrent un groupe uni. Les cachalots se portent mutuellement secours et communiquent en permanence. Elles montrent aussi que les cachalots chassent dans l'obscurité totale. Ils se servent de leur puissant système d'écolocalisation. Mais pourquoi chassent-ils de nuit dans les profondeurs alors que les calamars géants sont en surface? L'équipe a maintenant une petite idée sur la question. Elle a reconstitué la traque à partir de toutes les données collectées sur les cachalots et les calamars géants. Voici ce qui se passe. 18 heures. Les cachalots sont en surface. Ils se reposent et accumulent de l'oxygène dans leurs muscles. Bientôt, ils seront prêts à plonger. À 400 mètres de profondeur, une colonne de calamars géants est en train de remonter à la surface. C'est là que se trouvent leurs proies, les poissons. Chaque nuit, les poissons des profondeurs remontent pour se nourrir de plancton. Le cachalot a passé 8 minutes en surface. Il prend sa respiration et plonge. Il descend droit vers les abysses. Il ne marque aucun arrêt en chemin. Près de la surface, les calamars géants chassent les poissons. C'est une activité épuisante car ils supportent mal cette eau trop chaude pour eux. Les données montrent que les calamars géants redescendent à plusieurs reprises dans les profondeurs, sans doute pour se rafraîchir. Ils reprennent des forces avant une nouvelle incursion à la surface. C'est là que les cachalots les attendent. Les capteurs montrent qu'ils patrouillent dans cette zone à 400 mètres de profondeur. Ici, le taux d'oxygène est extrêmement bas. Il n'est que de 10% par rapport à la surface. Et c'est un problème pour les calamars géants.
Les calamars géants sont d'ordinaire extrêmement rapides, mais le faible taux d'oxygène les rend peut-être moins vifs et plus faciles à attraper.
Les cachalots s'attaquent donc à eux quand ils sont les plus vulnérables. Pour les scientifiques, ce film est une avancée considérable.
Je vais conserver cette vidéo. Je vais la regarder encore et encore.
Je suis bluffé par ce qu'on a recueilli. Je ne m'attendais pas à voir autant de choses. En regardant ces images, on se rend bien compte que ces animaux essaient de s'entraider. Ils forment une véritable famille.
Ce sont des animaux merveilleux. Nous ne comprenons pas les sociétés qu'ils forment, mais on sait qu'ils ont besoin les uns des autres.
Les scientifiques n'ont pas réussi à filmer des cachalots traquant les calamars géants comme ils l'espéraient. Mais leurs efforts n'ont pas été vains. Leurs images sous-marines témoignent de l'incroyable solidarité de ces grands mammifères.
De temps en temps, on a la chance de découvrir quelque chose d'inédit, quelque chose que personne n'avait jamais vu.
Un jour, peut-être, des caméras parviendront enfin à filmer cet incroyable combat abyssal entre cachalots et calamars géants. Mais pour l'instant, son déroulement demeure un mystère.
While the adults devote most of their waking hours to foraging for food, the youngsters devote most of theirs to play. Park guards have named this 3-year-old Nzeli. They call his friend Imvura. At 8 years, Karira is a bit of a bully. Washushwe is only 4. The games they play help the youngsters determine their status in the group. Childhood can last anywhere from 8 to 12 years, but the gorillas' need to maintain their status never seems to end. Any opportunity to reinforce the hierarchy is seized upon. Then comes young adulthood. At 13, Intwari has the beginnings of a silverback and his first real sense of the power that comes along with it. He also has a dedicated young male follower. But what Intwari really wants is the attention and allegiance of the females in the group. Umagumi doesn't seem too threatened by Ntwari's advances towards the females. Well over 400 pounds, the dominant male silverback could easily discipline the younger one, or throw him out of the group altogether. For now, Umagumi seems content to focus on the local vegetation, of which he eats some 50 pounds a day. Mountain gorillas are mainly vegetarian, with a few ants and grubs thrown in for good measure. Their staple diet includes a bitter, stinging mixture of thistles, nettles, goosegrass, bamboo, and wild celery. Although he has already begun to experiment with the food his mother likes to eat, Abumwe will continue to rely on her milk until he's 3 years old. By the time he's 4, Abumwe will be strong enough to forage on his own. Mountain gorillas are generally well adapted to the world in which they live. But however idyllic their home may appear, for the youngsters in the group, the mountains hold many perils. Many newborns simply don't survive. Mbele gave birth 2 days ago. It will be several months before she can even let go of her baby, much less let him out of her sight. The mountain gorillas are more vulnerable than they know. Their ancestral home is much smaller than it once was. All around them, human activity is increasing. Yet the mountain gorillas continue to live and move in ways familiar to them for generations. They do not distinguish between thistles and meadows that are inside the park and thistles and meadows that are outside it. They simply go where their never-ending search for food takes them. Only now they find others there. Both the mountain gorillas and their forest sanctuary now receive official protection. Park guards and anti-poaching patrols go to the forest every day. To protect the gorillas and all the other wildlife, the patrols search for and destroy snares that local hunters have set for game. The guards search the forest, checking on the gorilla's whereabouts and welfare. The same guards who name the mountain gorillas at birth follow their progress for years, watching as the gorillas grow to maturity. Over time, a close relationship develops, a bond between the animals and the men. Almost every day it rains. The mountain gorillas don't seem to like it. They don't seem to know what to do about it either, other than simply wait it out. At least the rain provides them with a rich supply of food. After feeding, the family gathers around the silverback, Umagumi. While the adults rest, the youngsters play. For the group's leading young adult male, it's become much more than play. Left unchecked, Intwari's newfound strength could eventually tear the group apart. The threat Intwari represents puts females such as Poppy on edge. Determined to get some kind of reaction from the others, Intwari bites into an inedible plant and contemplates his next move. This time, even Umagumi seems uneasy. Intwari is presenting himself as their new leader, but the females don't see it that way. Having forced Intwari out, the group moves on. Before she joins them, Poppy, still vibrating with excess energy, vents it on the first young male she can find. To be pushed out for good seems harsh, but what Intwari really needs now is time and space to mature, to the point where he too can have a family of his own. The next few years are critical for Intwari. They are also critical for all the other mountain gorillas. Whether the outside world will allow Intwari and the others the time and space they need is an open question. One thing is certain. If the mountain gorillas are to survive, we will have to protect them and their forest home forever. If we ever turn our backs, they'll be gone.